As Hitler's forces moved through Europe, America transformed itself from isolated backwater to becoming an industrial leader, using vast numbers of tanks to challenge the Axis forces. One of the weapons that helped win the war was the Sherman Tank. On September 15, 1916, the British Army used tanks for the first time in battle. Back in Britain, tanks were seen as an important tool for winning wars. Unlike France and Britain, by 1917, America had not developed its own tank, nor had been exposed to tank warfare before it joined the Allies in the Western Front. During the 1920s and 1930s, tank development was not considered the priority. By the late 1930s, America's tank arsenal consisted of a few hundred light tanks left over from the First World War. By the end of the 1940s, it was clear that if America was to enter the war, it would need a tank that would at least match German Panzer Model 3. America, with its huge steel works and car factories, was perfectly equipped to produce tanks. Military funds were available to design a successful American World War tank. On the other hand, the German army already started to upgrade the Panzer Model 3, and the Allies' time was running out. By April 1941, a new medium tank was already in the production line. The Lee Grant played a crucial part in the North African campaign, earning the title Egypt's Last Hope. However, it proved unable to deal with the Panzer IV and was eventually replaced by the American Sherman Tank, which was a significant improvement to the M3. Its wartime career did not end there, though. In 1944, a number of Lees were sent to the mountains of jungles of Burma, when they helped the Allies to defeat the Japanese army. What the Allies needed was a tank that could be built in large numbers by a civilian workforce. Not only did it need to be effective in the battle, but it needed to be easy to operate and maintain. So designers came up with a medium tank that they hoped would fit the place. The Americans called it the M4 and the British named it the Sherman. The M4, or Sherman, was a medium tank that had 5-man crew. Beside its main 75mm gun and the turret, the Sherman also mounted 3 machine guns as well as 50.8mm smoke mortar. Its armor was up to 100mm thick. Moreover, its powerful Ford V8 engine was meant to be capable of a range of 100 miles and a brake horsepower of 500 and top road speed of 26 miles per hour. By the start of the 1940s, the orders for making the Sherman tank were pouring in, and US factories were under immense pressure to produce enough tanks. These tanks must be cheap, quick, and enough to compete with German tanks. Because the Sherman inherited many functions of the Lee Grant, the existing tank assembly line could easily be adapted without causing the drop in production. Some historians predicted that American factories produced 50,000 Sherman tanks during World War II. The Sherman tank entered service with the British 8th Army in Egypt, 1942. After months of bitter fighting against the Desert Fox, commanded by Field Marshal Rommel, the British Army was exhausted. British General Bernard Montgomery was challenged to win the battle from an unfavourable situation. He needed to prepare his men to stage the final battle to kick the Axis out of Egypt. Meanwhile, the arrival of 300 Shermans could not have been more timely. Even though the Sherman was an upgrade of Lee Grant, General Montgomery believed that the Shermans would not be even compatible against Mark IV. He stated that when you compare Mark IV with the Sherman, the Mark IV would win. On the other hand, Germans were already upgrading its Panzer III, which was already one of the principal threats, later upgraded to Panzer IV, which was thought to be more powerful with the long barrel gun. This immediately put the Shermans in the disadvantages because the Shermans didn't have any short to medium length weapon. Because one of the biggest problems with Shermans was that the Shermans were built to withstand 37mm armor-piercing ammunition. But when the Germans started using their 88mm anti-aircraft gun to kill out tanks, the Sherman thin armor made it extremely vulnerable to catch on fire. Despite these problems, British and American crew had many reasons to be pleased with the Sherman. In December 1941, the United States officially declared war on the Axis, starting from Operation Torch. The troops landed in North Africa the following November. By early 1943, the American army was impatient to take on the Afrika Korps, which by this time had been pushed back. By this stage of the Long Desert Campaign, the differences between the hardened British tank crew and their American counterparts began to show. By this stage, the British tank crew was experienced on what Germans could, and the American tank crew was inexperienced and had no idea on what Germans could do. Because of that, the Americans met with a terrible disaster at Kasserine Pass, which was the first major clash between the German armour and American armour. 1,000 were killed at Kasserine Pass, hundreds were taken prisoner, and most of their Lee tanks were destroyed. The Americans used Lee tanks during the battle, which proved completely ineffective against the fearsome 88mm anti-tank gun. It was a turning point for the US Army, and Lee Grant was replaced by the Shermans, which went on to become the main Allied tank for the rest of the war. Despite losses on some fronts, the adaptability of the Sherman allowed innovation that saved countless lives. There were numbers of Sherman tank variants used in this battle. One of the most useful variants that emerged from the Desert Campaign was the Sherman Crab. The Sherman Crab had a roller on the front of the tank with the length of chain and was used for clearing minefield, whereas the places of chains beat on the ground in front of it and exploded the anti-tank mines. It was an effective way of clearing land through the minefield. In 1943, a small Allied force invaded Sicily and over the following months fought its way up Italy's Sicily. The ragged trails favoured German defenders and presented huge challenges to Allied tactics. With the Sherman Tank 75mm gun, it could penetrate 3.7 inches armour plate. The trouble was with the German tanks such as the Panther and the Tiger's front armour was 4 inches or better, so in any frontal engagement the Sherman tank was at a big disadvantage. Therefore, the only way to take against German tanks would be to sneak up on it and try to get it from the rear. The German tank's standard gun was 88mm. It started life as an anti-aircraft gun and was adapted to protect German warships from enemy planes. No Allied tanks could withstand the hit from the 88mm anti-gun. These included the Sherman. In response to the difficulties faced by the Allies in Italy, attempts were made to improve the Sherman's performance. Early in 1944, preparations started for the invasion of Normandy. On the other hand, the Italian campaign told the Allies to expect an unforgiven trail and more Tiger and Panther tank. So America considered producing a heavy tank called the M6. But making this new model would mean changing assembly lines and causing production levels to drop. The Allies were left with little choice but to upgrade the Sherman. The numbers of senior production engineers suggested an improved gun on the Sherman. Despite a difficult trail at Normandy, the Firefly performed well. Its bigger gun worked wonders for the British Army. The Firefly had a chance with the Germans' Panther and could even take on a Tiger tank. It worked for the British Army, and they did have one Firefly each with 4 tanks who had 3 ordinary Sherman tanks and a Firefly. On the other hand, the American didn't take that up. Instead, they preferred to use their own American 76mm gun, Sherman tank, which actually wasn't as effective as Firefly. In June 1944, Allies troops mounted an invasion of Normandy in northwestern France. Although the Firefly performed well, its armour was truly thin to withstand firearms from German tanks. Because the technical difficulties between the German tanks and M4 Shermans are quite significant in terms of armour as well as in terms of actual guns dismounted on the tank. In the end, the armour of newest Shermans couldn't solve the armour protection issue. This problem led to development of T-14, or known as the Sherman Jumbo. Besides having much thicker armour, it also had extra wide tracks. It was essentially used to lead tank formations, and as a lead tank, they would be able to take a fair amount of German anti-tanks out of the battlefield. But in the end, it couldn't be used as a main tank because it was too heavy for the transportation and suspension. But the US generals knew that war would not only be won on the battlefield, but in America's tank factories. By 1944, the sheer number of Shermans was starting to tip the balance in favor of the Allies. But despite attempts to improve Sherman's armor, it was never as protective as Tiger or Panther. Other Shermans were turned into engineering vehicles for construction or demolition. The crab tank was fitted with flails to clear mines. Tank destroyers were also created by removing their turrets and adding high-caliber guns to target enemy tanks. Flamethrowers were added to some Shermans to help clear bunkers or dense vegetation. While the crocodile tank was a flamethrower version of the Churchill tank, the Sherman had similar adaptations for specific tasks. Shermans were also converted into transport vehicles for ammunition, fuel, or troops. Bulldozer-equipped versions cleared debris and created paths through obstacles. Another version, known as the bridge carrier, carried portable bridges for assault operations. However, the one and the most well-known modification was the duplex drive system. The duplex drive allowed the Sherman to move using its tracks on land or marine propellers in water. This development came after lessons learned from the Pacific Front in 1942 and was used during the D-Day invasion. The Sherman became the main Allied tank of World War II. While it couldn't match the largest German tanks in firepower or armor, its reliability and speed made it popular among crews. Its strong and adaptable hull was perfect for modifications, and its simple design allowed it to be mass-produced in large numbers by civilian workers. By the end of the battle, the German army could no longer handle the large numbers of Shermans in the battlefield. It truly was the Allied workforce that helped to win the war. The Sherman wasn't the best tank in one-on-one combat. It was just comparable to the German Panzer IV in terms of power. However, it was dependable and easy to maintain. Because the Sherman was produced in 11 factories, including one in Canada, over 55,000 Shermans were built during the war. One of the key reasons the Sherman tank became so effective was its design philosophy. While German tanks like the Panther and Tiger were built for superior firepower and armor, the Sherman was designed with a different approach. American engineers prioritized mass production, reliability, and adaptability over sheer firepower. This approach allowed the Sherman to be produced quickly and in large numbers, ensuring the Allies always had tanks on the battlefield, even if individual Shermans were outmatched by German designs. The use of automotive industry practices made the Sherman tank easy to maintain in the field. Soldiers could repair damaged tanks using parts that were readily available, and crews were trained to make basic repairs themselves. This simplicity gave the Allies a consistent advantage, as damaged Shermans could often return to battle quickly. The mismatch between the Sherman and German tanks like the Tiger and Panther forced Allied crews to adopt creative tactics. One common strategy was the use of coordinated attacks, where multiple Shermans would flank a German tank to target its weaker side or rear armor. Crews relied on speed and maneuverability to compensate for the Sherman's thinner armor and less powerful gun. In many cases, the Sherman's greatest strength wasn't its firepower, but its ability to outnumber German forces. For every Tiger or Panther on the battlefield, there were often several Shermans. This numerical advantage allowed the Allies to sustain losses and still maintain the upper hand in prolonged engagements. While the Sherman Crab and Sherman Firefly are among the most well-known variants, there were many others that served unique roles on the battlefield. For instance, the Sherman Calliope was equipped with a rocket launcher system mounted on top of its turret. This variant provided powerful support during assaults by launching a barrage of rockets to weaken enemy defenses before troops advanced. Another interesting variant was the Sherman Beach Armored Recovery Vehicle, which was designed to operate in shallow water and assist in recovery operations during beach landings. It was particularly useful during the D-Day invasion, helping to move vehicles and equipment that became stuck in the sand. While the Sherman is often associated with battles in Europe and North Africa, it also played an important role in the Pacific theater. In battles like those on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Shermans were used to support infantry in rugged and heavily fortified terrain. The terrain in the Pacific Islands presented challenges similar to those in Italy, but with the added difficulty of dense jungles and hidden fortifications. Sherman tanks equipped with flamethrowers, such as the Sherman Crocodile, proved particularly effective in the Pacific. These tanks were used to clear bunkers and caves where Japanese forces often hid. Although they were not designed for jungle warfare, The Sherman's reliability allowed it to be modified to suit the unique demands of the Pacific Campaign. The success of the Sherman tank wasn't just about its design, it was also about logistics. American factories didn't just produce tanks, they also produced the spare parts, fuel, and ammunition needed to keep them in operation. The ability to keep Shermans supplied in the field meant that they could stay in battle longer than their German counterparts, which often struggled with supply shortages. The standardization of parts across Sherman models made logistics easier for the Allies. Crews didn't have to wait for specific components, as many parts were interchangeable between different Sherman variants. The Panther was officially known as the Panther. It had a crew of 5 members, including a commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator. The Panther was armed with a 75mm KVK 42L70 gun, which had excellent range and accuracy. This gun could easily penetrate the armor of most Allied tanks, including the Sherman. The tank had 80mm of sloped frontal armor, which was designed to deflect incoming shells. Its side armor was thinner, at 40 to 50mm, making it vulnerable to attacks from the sides. The Panther was powered by a Maybach V12 Petrol engine that produced 700 horsepower. Despite these problems, when the Panther was functioning, it proved to be a formidable weapon. Its 75mm gun was accurate and powerful, capable of destroying Soviet T-34 tanks at long distances. The Panther's sloped armor, which was 80mm thick at the front, provided excellent protection against Soviet shells. This slope design made it harder for enemy rounds to penetrate, as the angle often deflected incoming fire. One German gunner recalled engaging a Soviet column from nearly 1,500 meters away, knocking out several T-34s before the Soviets could return fire. However, this advantage was often short-lived. The Panther's slow turret rotation and weak side armor made it vulnerable to flanking attacks, a tactic Soviet tank crews quickly adopted. Soviet commanders often sent lighter, more maneuverable tanks like the T-70 to distract Panthers, while T-34s moved in from the sides to exploit their vulnerabilities. The harsh conditions of the Eastern Front also made it difficult for the Panzer. Freezing winters caused engine oil to thicken and parts to seize up, leaving many tanks immobile during critical moments. During the Soviet counteroffensive in late 1943, a Panther crew stationed near Kiev recalled struggling to start their tank in sub-zero temperatures as Soviet artillery zeroed in on their position. The crew narrowly escaped by abandoning their vehicle and retreating on foot. In spring and autumn, the infamous mud of the Eastern Front, known as the Rasputitsa, created further challenges. Panthers, with their heavy weight and relatively narrow tracks, often became stuck in deep mud. In one incident, near the Dnieper River, an entire platoon of Panthers attempting to cross a muddy field became bogged down, leaving them as easy targets for Soviet infantry equipped with anti-tank rifles and Molotov cocktails. Survivors from the engagement later reported the frustration of seeing their advanced tanks rendered useless by the terrain. As the war continued, the Germans worked to improve the Panther's reliability. Later models featured stronger transmissions and improved engines, addressing some of the early problems. However, these updates came too late to make a significant impact. The Panthers deployed during the Battle of Kursk had taught Soviet commanders important lessons about exploiting the tank's weaknesses. Soviet gunners learned to aim for the Panther's turret ring or side armor, both of which were less protected. This knowledge spread quickly through Soviet tank units, making every engagement more dangerous for the Panther crews. After the Eastern Front, in 1944, the Panther tank was sent to the Western Front to defend against the Allied invasion of Europe. By this time, the Panther had become a mainstay of German armored divisions. It was meant to counter tanks like the American Sherman and the British Churchill. With its long-range gun and thick frontal armor, the Panther was well suited for open-field battles. The Panther saw extensive use during the Battle of Normandy, which began in June 1944 after the D-Day landings. the dense hedgerows of Normandy created a challenging environment for tanks. The Panther, designed for long-range combat in open terrain, struggled in these conditions. Its large size and weight made it difficult to maneuver through the narrow lanes and tight corners. The Allies, on the other hand, used smaller, more agile tanks like the Sherman, which could navigate the terrain more easily. Despite these difficulties, the Panther was a deadly opponent in Normandy. Its 75mm gun could destroy Allied tanks from distances that the Sherman's 75mm gun couldn't reach. Allied crews often reported that it took multiple Shermans to take down a single Panther. This was because the Panther's frontal armor was nearly impervious to the Sherman's gunfire, forcing Allied tanks to flank the Panther and target its thinner side or rear armor. One of the Panther's main weaknesses was its reliability. The mechanical issues that had plagued the Panther on the Eastern Front were still present on the Western Front. Engines overheated during long marches, and transmission failures were common. These breakdowns often left Panthers stranded and vulnerable to air attacks by Allied fighter bombers. The Allies used their air superiority to target German tanks and supply lines, further reducing the effectiveness of the Panther. Another major challenge for the Panther was logistics. The tank was expensive to produce, and Germany was struggling to keep up with the demands of the war. Spare parts were often in short supply, which made it difficult to repair damaged tanks. Additionally, the Panther consumed a lot of fuel, and Germany's dwindling fuel supplies became a serious problem in the later stages of the war. Despite its challenges, the Panther remained a deadly adversary. Its combination of firepower and frontal armor meant that in defensive positions or open terrain, a well-placed Panther could hold off multiple T-34s. In one notable battle near the town of Prokhorovka in 1944, a single Panther commanded by a veteran tank ace reportedly destroyed more than 10 Soviet tanks before being immobilized by an anti-tank gun. The crew managed to hold their position until reinforcements arrived, a rare example of the Panther's potential when used effectively. While the Panther was one of the most advanced tanks on the Eastern Front and on the Western Front, its real-world performance was a mix of successes and failures. For every Soviet tank column it destroyed, there were stories of breakdowns, supply shortages, and the brutal conditions of the front that limited its effectiveness. In the end, the Panther's strengths couldn't fully overcome its weaknesses, especially as the Soviets continued to improve their tactics and equipment. The Panther played a significant role in major battles on the Western Front, including the Battle of the Bulge in late 1944. During this last-ditch German offensive, Panthers were used in large numbers to break through Allied lines. Although the Panther's firepower and armor made it effective in certain situations, the Allies were able to counter it with superior tactics and overwhelming numbers. By 1945, the Panther was still one of the most feared tanks on the battlefield, but it could not stop the Allied advance into Germany. There were numbers of Panther tank variants used in World War II. One of the most useful variants that emerged was the command tank. This version was equipped with extra radio equipment to improve communication with other units. Command tanks played a vital role in coordinating attacks and defensive maneuvers, especially in large-scale battles like Kursk. To make room for the radios, some of the ammunition storage was reduced. While it carried less firepower, the command tank was critical for managing large tank formations effectively. On the other hand, Germany faced significant losses of armored vehicles, and many Panthers were damaged in combat. To solve this, the Panther chassis was used to create recovery vehicles, known as Panther. These vehicles were equipped with winches and cranes to tow damaged tanks off the battlefield. The Panther was essential for keeping Panther units operational, especially since the Panther's complex design made it difficult to repair in the field. Crews relied on these recovery vehicles to quickly remove damaged tanks before they could be captured or destroyed by the enemy. There were also attempts to equip the Panther with flamethrowers for clearing enemy fortifications. This variant was designed to help in urban combat and dense forests, where close-range fighting was common. However, only a small number of these flamethrower Panthers were built, as their usefulness was limited compared to other flamethrower-equipped tanks like the Churchill Crocodile. The Panther chassis was also adapted to carry heavier artillery for long-range support. One example was the Panther with an 8.8 cm KWK 43 gun, which was essentially an anti-aircraft and anti-tank weapon mounted on the Panther frame. This variant was intended to provide even greater firepower against heavily armored Allied tanks, like the IS-2 from the Soviet Union. While this version was powerful, its production numbers were low due to resource shortages in the later stages of the war. Germany also experimented with anti-aircraft versions of the Panther, such as the Flak Panther. These tanks were equipped with anti-aircraft guns, including quad-mounted 20mm cannons or single 37mm cannons, to protect armored units from Allied air attacks. As the Allies gained air superiority, anti-aircraft Panthers became more necessary, but very few were built because of Germany's limited production capacity. The Panther's versatility allowed it to serve in many roles beyond that of a traditional battle tank. Its powerful 75mm gun was effective against most Allied tanks, and its sloped armor provided excellent protection from frontal attacks. These strengths made it an ideal platform for conversion into specialized vehicles like command tanks, recovery vehicles, and anti-aircraft units. However, the Panther's mechanical issues often limited the effectiveness of these variants. The complexity of its engine and transmission meant that even modified Panthers faced the same reliability problems as the original model. Additionally, the high cost and time required to produce each Panther meant that Germany could not create as many variants as they needed. One of the most ambitious Panther projects was the Panther II, an upgraded version designed to solve some of the original tank's weaknesses. The Panther II was supposed to have thicker armor, improved suspension, and better reliability. However, only prototypes were completed before the project was cancelled due to Germany's focus on producing existing tanks to meet immediate needs. While it never saw combat, the Panther II showed Germany's continued effort to improve its tank designs, even as the war turned against them. By the end of the war, Panther variants were used in increasingly desperate situations. The command tanks were one in organizing Germany's defenses during battles like the Battle of the Bulge, while recovery vehicles helped salvage what was left of Germany's dwindling armored forces. Anti-aircraft Panthers were used to defend key positions from Allied bombers, but their numbers were too few to make a significant impact. Despite their limitations, Panther variants demonstrated the adaptability of German engineering during World War II. Each version addressed specific needs on the battlefield, whether it was providing long-range firepower, coordinating large tank formations, or recovering damaged vehicles. However, the lack of resources and the growing strength of Allied forces meant that even these efforts could not prevent Germany's eventual defeat. The success of Panther variants also depended heavily on logistics. Germany's ability to supply parts, fuel, and ammunition to its armored units became increasingly strained as the war continued. The Panther's need for frequent repairs made it a burden on already stretched supply lines. Recovery vehicles like the Berger Panther helped solve this issue, but even they couldn't keep up with the growing number of damaged tanks. One of the key advantages of Allied tanks like the Sherman was their standardized parts, which made repairs faster and easier. The Panther, on the other hand, required specialized components that were often hard to come by in the later stages of the war. This limited the effectiveness of even the most advanced Panther variants. During the Second World War, Germany revolutionized its tank design to maintain its dominance on the battlefield. As German forces advanced through Europe, the need for a newer, more powerful tank became evident. The weapon that would show Germany's strength and innovation throughout the war was the Tiger I tank. By the late 1930s, Germany's tanks, like the Panzer III and Panzer IV, were effective but were vulnerable. The German Blitzkrieg relied on speed and firepower, but when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, its tank war faced a new challenge. Soviet T-34s and KV-1s outmatched German tanks in armor and firepower. German tank crews often struggled against the Soviet designs, and it became clear that a new tank was needed. In view of these points, in early 1942, work began on a heavy tank that could dominate the battlefield. It would need to have thick armor to withstand enemy fire and a powerful gun to destroy the T-34s and KV-1s. The new tank was designed to have an 88mm KWK-36 gun, originally used as an anti-aircraft weapon, which had already proven deadly against tanks. This gun would become one of the Tiger's defining features. During battles in France and North Africa, German gunners had adapted the 88mm gun to destroy Allied armor at significant distances. This success inspired German engineers to equip it directly into the Tiger's design. The 88mm gun offered unmatched precision and penetration, allowing the Tiger to engage and destroy enemy tanks before they could get close enough to retaliate. Its inclusion turned the Tiger into a formidable force on the battlefield, capable of shaping the outcome of engagements with its long-range firepower. Unlike earlier German tanks, such as the Panzer III and IV, the Tiger was not designed with speed or mobility as a priority. Instead, its focus was on unmatched firepower and protection. The Tiger's frontal armor was 100mm thick, a revolutionary feature at the time. This thickness made it almost invulnerable to most Allied weapons, including the standard 75mm guns on American Sherman tanks and Soviet T-34s. The armor was also carefully angled to increase its effectiveness, making incoming rounds more likely to deflect rather than penetrate. The Tiger's side armor, measuring 80mm thick, was another improvement over earlier designs. However, it was not as heavily reinforced as the front, leaving the Tiger vulnerable to flanking attacks. Enemy tactics often focused on attacking Tigers with multiple tanks to exploit these weaker side areas. The sheer weight of the armor, combined with the tank's overall design, made the Tiger much heavier than its predecessors, tipping the scales at over 54 tons. This weight presented logistical challenges, including difficulty crossing bridges, navigating muddy terrain, and maintaining the tank in harsh conditions. The Tiger I went into production in 1942 and was first used in combat on the Eastern Front. It was introduced during the Battle of Leningrad, where it faced off against Soviet forces. Despite mechanical problems in its early models, the Tiger quickly gained a fearsome reputation. Its 88mm gun could destroy enemy tanks at long ranges, often before they could even return fire. It was first deployed in 1942 near Leningrad and quickly gained a reputation for its heavy armor and powerful gun. At a time when German tanks like the Panzer III and IV were struggling to match the Soviet T-34s and KV-1s, the Tiger I was introduced to turn the tide in Germany's favor. The Tiger I's 88mm gun, which was originally designed for anti-aircraft use but adapted for tank combat. This gun could destroy enemy tanks from over 1,500 meters, giving it a significant advantage in open terrain. Its thick frontal armor, measuring up to 100mm, could withstand most Allied and Soviet tank guns. However, its side and rear armor, while still thick, were weaker, making the tank vulnerable to flanking attacks. When the Tiger I was first used in combat near Leningrad, its presence was intimidating. Soviet crews quickly learned to avoid direct confrontations with Tigers, preferring to use coordinated attacks to overwhelm them. The Tiger's first missions were not without problems, though. Mechanical issues were common, with engines overheating and transmissions failing under the stress of the tank's weight, which was over 54 tons. In 1943, the Tiger I played a significant role during the Battle of Kursk, one of the largest tank battles in history. German commanders relied on the Tiger's long-range firepower to destroy Soviet tanks before they could get close. In open fields, the Tiger proved effective, but the challenging terrain and Soviet minefields created difficulties. Many Tigers were immobilized before they could engage in battle. Despite this, the Tigers that remained operational inflicted heavy losses on Soviet forces, with individual crews often recording dozens of tank kills in a single battle. Germany's industrial strength allowed for precision engineering, but this also made the Tiger expensive and time-consuming to produce. The Tiger I was not designed for mass production like Allied tanks, such as the Sherman. Each Tiger required specialized parts and skilled workers, limiting the total number that could be built. By the end of the war, only about 1,300 Tiger I tanks had been produced. The Tiger was designed to break through enemy lines and hold strategic positions, but its heavy weight created challenges. At over 54 tons, the tank often struggled on soft ground, and its reliability in rough conditions was a constant problem. Mechanical failures were common, and many Tigers were abandoned due to breakdowns rather than enemy fire. On the other hand, the Tiger I first appeared on the Western Front in 1943 during the Battle of Tunisia. Deployed alongside Panzer III and IV tanks, the Tiger was meant to support German defenses against the advancing British and American forces. Allied crews were shocked by the Tiger's firepower and armor, as their Shermans and other tanks struggled to penetrate its thick plating. The 88mm gun allowed Tiger crews to destroy Allied tanks before they could close the distance, creating a sense of fear among the opposition. However, the Tiger's heavy weight and mechanical complexity were significant drawbacks in the harsh desert environment. Sand and dust often caused the engines to overheat, and breakdowns left many Tigers stranded. One Tiger unit, led by German tank ace Michael Wittmann, famously destroyed over a dozen British tanks and vehicles in a single engagement at Villers-Bocage, demonstrating the tank's potential when used strategically. Despite its firepower, the Tiger faced growing challenges on the Western Front. Allied air superiority made resupplying and repairing Tigers increasingly difficult. The tank's heavy fuel consumption further strained German logistics. Many Tigers were abandoned not because of enemy action, but because they ran out of fuel or broke down. By late 1944, Allied crews had learned to work together to outflank Tigers, targeting their weaker side or rear armor. The Tiger was a powerful tank on its own, but over time, different versions and adaptations were created to suit specific battlefield needs. These variants were there to solve the challenges faced by German forces and expand the Tiger's role in various combat situations. While not produced in as many forms as the Sherman, the Tiger's variants showed how the tank could be adapted for different tasks. One of the most important variants of the Tiger I was the Command Tiger. These tanks were modified to act as mobile command centers for high-ranking officers on the battlefield. Instead of focusing on firepower, Command Tigers were equipped with extra radios to improve communication between tank units and headquarters. These radios helped coordinate attacks and defensive operations, especially during large-scale battles like Kursk. To make room for the additional equipment, some of the tank's ammunition storage was removed. This meant the Command Tiger carried fewer rounds than a standard Tiger, which could be a disadvantage if it became involved in a prolonged firefight. Another variant was the Recovery Tiger. This version was designed to assist with recovering damaged or stuck tanks from the battlefield. The Tiger's immense weight often meant that other vehicles couldn't tow it, so a specialized recovery vehicle was necessary. The Recovery Tiger was equipped with a crane mounted on its chassis, which could lift heavy components like engines or even entire tank turrets. This variant saw limited use because of its complexity and the shortage of available Tigers, but it demonstrated the need for logistical support in tank operations. One of the more unique variants was the Sturm Tiger, or Assault Tiger. This heavily armored version of the Tiger I was fitted with a 380mm rocket mortar, making it one of the most destructive tanks of the war. The Sturm Tiger was designed for urban combat and was used to destroy buildings, bunkers, and fortifications. Its massive weapon could fire shells capable of leveling entire structures, making it a fearsome tool during battles in cities like Warsaw. However, the Sturm Tiger was slow and carried limited ammunition due to the size of its rockets. Loading each round required a crane, and its use was mostly restricted to specific missions where overwhelming firepower was needed. In addition to these official variants, many Tiger I tanks were modified in the field by their crews to meet immediate combat needs. For example, extra arm, where crews often added additional armor plating or sandbags to the sides of the tank to protect against anti-tank weapons. Another example was using infrared equipment. Late in the war, some Tigers were outfitted with experimental infrared scopes for night fighting. These scopes were rare and unreliable, but represented Germany's attempts to innovate under pressure. By 1944, the Tiger I had become one of the most recognizable tanks of the war. Its combination of heavy armor and a devastating gun made it a formidable opponent, but its weaknesses in production and reliability highlighted the challenges Germany faced as the war dragged on. However, while it had many strengths, the Tiger was not without its problems. These challenges, although not immediately obvious, sometimes made it difficult for the tank to perform at its best. Below, one of its first major challenges was its mechanical strength. The Tiger I was fitted with advanced mechanical systems for its time, including the Maybach HL230 engine. This engine provided enough power to move the 54-ton tank across battlefields. The suspension system also allowed the Tiger to handle rough terrain better than earlier German tanks. When operational, it was a reliable and sturdy machine. However, the complexity of its mechanical systems was a double-edged sword. The Tiger's engine often overheated during long missions, especially in hot climates like North Africa. Its transmission system, designed to handle the tank's weight, frequently broke down under the strain. In the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front, snow and mud clogged its tracks, making movement difficult. Repairing these issues required trained mechanics and specialized tools, which were not always available on the front lines. This left many Tigers stranded or abandoned, not due to enemy fire, but because of mechanical failures. Another limitation was its ammunition strength. One of the Tiger's best features was its powerful 88mm KWK-36 gun. This weapon had incredible range and accuracy, capable of destroying enemy tanks like the Sherman and T-34 from distances where they couldn't fire back effectively. This gave the Tiger a huge advantage in open battlefields, allowing crews to engage enemies before being targeted themselves. However, carrying ammunition for such a large gun presented challenges. The Tiger could hold up to 92 shells, but each shell was large and heavy, leaving little room for additional supplies like food, water, or spare parts. In long battles, Tigers often ran out of ammunition quickly. Resupplying these tanks on active battlefields was risky, as supply trucks were vulnerable to enemy attacks. Crews sometimes had to retreat or stop fighting altogether due to a lack of ammunition, even if their tanks were still operational. Deployment challenges were also there, as the Tiger was not designed to operate alone. It was most effective when working as part of a combined force with other tanks and infantry units. Commanders placed Tigers at the center of formations, using their thick frontal armor and powerful gun to lead the attack or hold defensive positions. In urban battles, the Tiger acted as a battering ram, breaking through fortified positions while infantry followed to secure the area. When deployed correctly, the Tiger could dominate the battlefield, forcing enemy units to retreat or avoid direct confrontation. But deploying the Tiger presented its own challenges. Its size and weight made it difficult to transport over long distances. Many bridges couldn't support its weight, requiring engineers to build temporary crossings or find alternate routes. In addition, the Tiger was slower than other tanks, making it harder to reposition quickly during battles. This lack of speed often left Tigers vulnerable to being surrounded or outflanked by faster enemy tanks. Fuel consumptions and logistics were also a headache. The tank's operational range was about 100 kilometers on roads and much less in rough terrain. This required a constant supply of fuel, which placed a heavy burden on Germany's already strained logistics network. As the war progressed and fuel shortages worsened, keeping the Tigers operational became a significant challenge. In some cases, Tiger units had to abandon their tanks because they ran out of fuel before reaching their objectives. Enemy forces often captured or destroyed these abandoned Tigers, turning what was meant to be an asset into a liability. The Tiger's armor was its most defining feature. The frontal armor, up to 100 millimeters thick, could deflect most enemy shells, making it nearly invulnerable in head-on engagements. This gave Tiger crews the confidence to face multiple enemy tanks, knowing they could withstand incoming fire while delivering enough counterattacks. However, the armor on the sides and rear was not as thick, making the Tiger vulnerable to flanking attacks. Enemy forces quickly adapted their tactics, coordinating attacks to surround the tank and target its weaker areas. Additionally, the heavy armor contributed to the Tiger's immense weight, which affected its mobility and increased the likelihood of mechanical failures. The Tiger's weight also backfired. At over 54 tons, the Tiger was one of the heaviest tanks of the war. This weight gave it stability and protection, but also created significant challenges. Muddy or snowy terrain often caused the Tiger to get stuck, requiring recovery vehicles to tow it out. Bridges built for lighter vehicles frequently collapsed under its weight, forcing Tiger units to find alternate routes or avoid certain areas altogether. The weight also placed extreme stress on the tank's suspension and drivetrain. Even with regular maintenance, these systems often failed, leaving the tank immobilized. Crews were trained to handle basic repairs, but many issues required specialized equipment and skilled mechanics, which were not always available in combat zones. As a ground-based weapon, the Tiger was incredibly effective against other tanks and fortified positions. However, it was highly vulnerable to air attacks. Allied air forces, especially after gaining air superiority in 1944, targeted Tigers with fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt and Hawker Typhoon. These planes carried rockets and bombs capable of destroying even the Tiger's thick armor. German commanders tried to solve this vulnerability by coordinating Tiger units with anti-aircraft guns and Luftwaffe support. Stuka dive bombers were often used to clear the skies and protect Tigers from air attacks. However, by the later stages of the war, Allied air dominance made such coordination increasingly difficult. Many Tigers were destroyed or abandoned due to relentless airstrikes, further limiting their impact on the battlefield. However, to solve some of these challenges, the Tiger was modified for specific roles. One variant, the Sturm Tiger, was equipped with a massive rocket launcher for destroying bunkers and fortifications. The Command Tiger was fitted with additional radios to coordinate battlefield operations. While these adaptations improved the Tiger's versatility, they also added to the complexity and cost of production. Field modifications were also common, as crews added extra armor or used camouflage to improve survivability. Some Tigers were even equipped with experimental infrared scopes for night operations, though these were rare and often unreliable. At the end, the Tiger had a psychological effect on the battlefield. Its mere presence often caused panic among enemy crews, who viewed it as an unstoppable force. Stories of single Tigers holding off entire units or destroying dozens of tanks in a single battle spread quickly, adding to its fearsome reputation. This fear worked in Germany's favor, as enemy forces often hesitated to engage Tigers directly. However, it also placed high expectations on the tank and its crews. Commanders sometimes relied too heavily on Tigers, expecting them to achieve results that were not realistic given their limitations. This over-reliance often left Tiger units isolated and overwhelmed by coordinated enemy attacks. Despite its effectiveness on the battlefield, the Tiger's impact was often outweighed by the numbers of Allied tanks like the Sherman, which were easier and faster to produce. In the end, the Tiger I's strengths and weaknesses reflected Germany's broader challenges during the war. It was a powerful machine that could dominate the battlefield under the right conditions, but its heavy weight, mechanical problems, and high cost limited its ability to change the course of the war. The Tiger I remains one of the most famous tanks of World War II, remembered for its firepower, armor, and the fear it inspired in its opponents. The Tiger's impact extended beyond its time in service. It influenced post-war tank designs and remains one of the most iconic symbols of World War II. While it was not without its flaws, the Tiger's presence changed the way tanks were used and viewed in modern warfare. It was both a weapon of power and a reminder of the limits of engineering under the pressures of war. During the years leading up to the Second World War, Germany worked to rebuild its military strength, including the development of more advanced tanks. Early tank designs like the Panzer I and II were useful for training and light support roles, but were not suitable for major battles. By the mid-1930s, it became clear that Germany needed a more capable tank for its expanding military campaigns. Introduced in 1936, the Panzer IV was originally designed as a support tank to work alongside the lighter Panzer III. The idea was for the Panzer III to handle enemy tanks, while the Panzer IV used its larger gun to destroy enemy positions, such as bunkers and anti-tank defenses. The Panzer IV was equipped with a short-barrel 75mm WW2 gun, which was effective against infantry and fortifications. It also had two machine guns, one mounted in the hull and the other in the turret, for close-range defense. Its 30mm frontal armor provided reasonable protection against small arms and light anti-tank weapons at the time. As Hitler's forces advanced through Europe, the Panzer IV proved to be an effective and reliable tank in its intended role. However, the rapid development of enemy tanks forced Germany to rethink its strategy. In 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa, it encountered the Soviet T-34 and K-1 tanks. These tanks had superior armor and firepower, which the Panzer III and early Panzer IV models could not match. To solve this issue, Germany upgraded the Panzer IV, turning it into a versatile main battle tank rather than just a support vehicle. The short-barrel gun was replaced with a long-barrel 75mm KWK-40 gun, which could penetrate thicker armor and effectively engage enemy tanks at longer ranges. Armor thickness was also increased to 50mm on the front and sides, making it more resistant to anti-tank weapons. Unlike the heavier Tiger and Panther tanks, the Panzer IV was relatively easy to produce. Its design allowed for mass production, which was vital for Germany's war effort. The Panzer IV became one of the most important tanks for Germany during the Second World War. By the time it arrived in North Africa, it had already proven its worth on the Eastern Front and in Europe. When the Afrika Korps, led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, began its campaign in the deserts of North Africa, the Panzer IV quickly became a critical weapon for the German forces. In early battles, the Panzer IV was equipped with a short-barreled 75mm gun designed for infantry support. It was effective against fortifications and lighter vehicles, but struggled against well-armored enemy tanks. As the war progressed, the Germans upgraded the Panzer IV with a long-barrel 75mm KWK-40 gun. This upgrade significantly improved its ability to engage Allied tanks at longer ranges. The Panzer IV was also a key tank in battles like Gazala and El Alamein, where it faced off against British tanks such as the Matilda and Crusader. The tank's upgraded gun allowed it to engage these targets effectively, often destroying them before they could close the distance. Its thicker frontal armor, which was later improved to 50mm and even 80mm in some variants, gave it better protection against British 2-pounder and 6-pounder anti-tank guns. At El Alamein, the Panzer IV helped Rommel's forces hold their positions despite being outnumbered. Its reliability in the harsh desert conditions gave German crews confidence. However, as more American tanks like the Sherman began arriving in British hands, the Panzer IV started facing tougher opposition. The desert environment was harsh for all tanks, including the Panzer IV. Sand often clogged the engines and tracks, causing breakdowns. The tank's relatively light weight compared to the Tiger allowed it to move more easily in soft sand, but prolonged operations placed a strain on its systems. German logistics struggled to provide spare parts and fuel, which were critical for keeping the Panzer IV operational. The arrival of Allied air superiority further complicated matters for the Panzer IV. Supply lines were frequently targeted, leaving tank units without the resources they needed to maintain their effectiveness. Despite this, Panzer IV crews managed to hold their ground in many battles, using their mobility and firepower to counter Allied advances. One of the Panzer IV's strengths was its adaptability. The Germans introduced several versions of the tank during the North African campaign, improving its armor and firepower to match evolving threats. Crews often added makeshift armor plates to protect against the increasing use of Allied anti-tank rifles and artillery. Specialized variants of the Panzer IV, such as command tanks equipped with advanced radio systems, allowed better coordination during battles. These command tanks were used to direct other units, ensuring that German forces could respond quickly to changing situations on the battlefield. Field Marshal Rommel relied heavily on the Panzer IV in his campaigns. He often used it as the backbone of his armored spearheads, combining its firepower with the lighter Panzer III tanks for flanking maneuvers. The Panzer IV's long-range gun was particularly useful for creating openings in enemy defenses, allowing German infantry and lighter tanks to follow through. One of the most notable uses of the Panzer IV was during the Battle of Kasserine Pass in early 1943. German forces, including Panzer IVs, exploited gaps in inexperienced American lines, causing significant losses. The Panzer IV's firepower and armor proved decisive in these engagements, allowing German forces to dominate the battlefield temporarily. Despite its strengths, the Panzer IV eventually faced overwhelming odds in North Africa. Allied forces, with their growing numbers of Shermans and the arrival of more advanced anti-tank weapons, began to turn the tide. By mid-1943, German forces were forced to retreat, and many Panzer IVs were abandoned due to fuel shortages or mechanical failures. The Panzer IV's role in North Africa highlighted its versatility and reliability. It served not only as a frontline battle tank, but also as a platform for various modifications, including recovery vehicles and anti-aircraft platforms. While it could not single-handedly change the course of the war, the Panzer IV remained a vital tool for German forces throughout the campaign. By 1942, the Panzer IV became the backbone of German armored forces, replacing the Panzer III as the primary tank used on all fronts. Its adaptability was another strength. The Panzer IV could be modified for different roles, such as mine clearing, bridge laying, and even as a platform for anti-aircraft guns. Over the course of the war, multiple specialized versions of the Panzer IV were developed to meet specific needs. Here's a closer look at these adaptations. Some Panzer IVs were modified into command tanks, specifically designed to coordinate operations on the battlefield. These tanks were fitted with additional radios and advanced communication equipment, allowing officers to issue orders effectively during large-scale battles like Kursk. However, to accommodate the extra equipment, they carried fewer ammunition rounds. This made them less suited for prolonged engagements, but invaluable in organizing and directing armored divisions. As the war progressed, the Panzer IV became a target for increasingly powerful anti-tank weapons. To counter threats like Soviet anti-tank rifles and shaped charge projectiles, many Panzer IVs were equipped with side skirts called Schürzen. These thin plates of armor were attached to the sides of the tank, providing additional protection against attacks aimed at the weaker side armor. This upgrade gave the Panzer IV better survivability in close combat and against infantry-based weapons. The Panzer IV's robust chassis made it ideal for creating mobile artillery units. One notable adaptation was the Hummel, which mounted a powerful 150mm howitzer. These mobile artillery platforms provided much-needed fire support for infantry, targeting enemy positions from a distance. Another adaptation was the Nashorn, armed with an 88mm gun, capable of destroying even the heaviest Allied tanks at long range. These versions added flexibility to the German armored forces. With Allied air superiority growing, the Panzer IV was adapted into anti-aircraft tanks, such as the Wirbelwind and Ostwind. These vehicles replaced the standard tank turret with anti-aircraft guns, allowing them to protect ground forces from strafing attacks by enemy planes. Although primarily designed to counter aircraft, these tanks were also effective against lightly armored ground targets, making them a dual-purpose tool in battle. These modifications allowed the Panzer IV to remain useful in a variety of combat situations, even as more advanced tanks like the Tiger and Panther were introduced. The Stug IV was an assault gun version of the Panzer IV. Instead of a turret, it featured a fixed superstructure with a powerful gun. This design was cheaper to produce and allowed the Stug IV to provide direct fire support for infantry. It was particularly effective in urban combat and against fortified positions, although its lack of a rotating turret limited its ability to respond quickly to threats. Engineers used the Panzer IV chassis to create a bridge-laying tank that could carry and deploy mobile bridges. This adaptation was crucial for maintaining mobility during operations in terrain with rivers or trenches. The bridge-laying Panzer IV allowed troops to cross obstacles quickly and maintain the momentum of an attack, particularly in regions where infrastructure had been damaged or destroyed. The Panzer IV also served as the basis for recovery vehicles designed to retrieve damaged or disabled tanks from the battlefield. These recovery tanks were equipped with cranes and winches, enabling them to tow other vehicles or lift heavy components like turrets and engines. This role was critical for maintaining the operational readiness of German armored units, especially in harsh conditions where breakdowns were common. The Brummbär, or known as Grizzly Bear, was a heavily armored version of the Panzer IV designed for urban combat. It was fitted with a short-barreled 150mm gun, capable of delivering devastating firepower against bunkers and buildings. The Brummbär was used during battles in cities like Warsaw, where its heavy weaponry helped German forces clear fortified areas. However, its slow speed and limited ammunition made it less effective in prolonged engagements. Toward the end of the war, some Panzer IVs were outfitted with experimental infrared scopes for night operations. These scopes allowed the tanks to identify and engage enemy targets in low-light conditions, providing a potential edge during nighttime battles. While these experiments showed promise, the equipment was rare and unreliable, limiting its overall impact. As the war progressed, the Panzer IV saw significant improvements in both armor and firepower. Early models had frontal armor of just 30mm, but later versions, such as the AUSF H and J, had up to 80mm of armor on the front. Side and rear armor were also reinforced to better protect the tank from flanking attacks. The long-barreled 75mm gun remained a key feature, allowing the Panzer IV to effectively engage enemy tanks like the Sherman and the T-34. The Panzer IV remained in production throughout the entire war, with over 8,500 units built. Its ability to adapt to new roles and challenges made it a valuable asset for the German military. While it was eventually outmatched by newer Allied tanks like the IS-2 and the Pershing, the Panzer IV continued to serve effectively in both offensive and defensive operations. In the end, the Panzer IV's success lay in its versatility. It served as a battle tank, a support vehicle, and a platform for numerous specialized roles. While it may not have been the most advanced tank of the war, its reliability and adaptability ensured that it remained a key part of Germany's armored forces until the very end. Despite its adaptability, the Panzer IV had limitations. Its relatively narrow tracks made it less effective in muddy or snowy terrain, especially on the Eastern Front. The tank's weight also increased with each upgrade, putting more strain on the engine and transmission. By the end of the war, the Panzer IV was less mobile and more prone to mechanical breakdowns than earlier models. Fuel shortages further limited the Panzer IV's effectiveness as German supply lines came under increasing pressure. Many Panzer IVs had to be abandoned due to a lack of fuel or spare parts, highlighting the logistical challenges faced by the German army. By the later stages of the war, the Panzer IV began to face significant challenges. Allied tanks like the American Sherman and the Soviet T-34 were being produced in much greater numbers. The Panzer IV's armor, though improved, was no match for advanced anti-tank weapons like the British 17-pounder gun and the Soviet 85mm cannon gun. The increasing weight of the upgraded Panzer IV models also put a strain on its engine and suspension, leading to frequent mechanical breakdowns. Despite these issues, The Panzer IV continued to serve as the workhorse of Germany's armoured divisions until the end of the war. By 1945, over 8,500 Panzer IVs had been produced, making it the most widely used German tank of World War II. By the late 1920s and 1930s, Soviet engineers were working on improving their armoured forces. Early Soviet tanks, like the BT series, were fast and maneuverable, but lacked the firepower and protection needed for modern warfare. These lighter tanks were sufficient for earlier conflicts, but could not withstand the challenges of a large-scale war. By 1939, it was clear that a new design was required. Soviet commanders recognized the importance of combining speed, firepower, and armor to create a tank capable of surviving the tough conditions of the Eastern Front. The result was a revolutionary medium tank that could meet these needs, the T-34. The T-34 was designed with a new sloped armor layout, which increased its resistance to enemy fire. This was a significant improvement over earlier tanks, whose flat armor was easier to penetrate. The sloped armor not only offered better protection, but also allowed the tank to be lighter than its heavily armored counterparts. Another key feature of the T-34 was its powerful 76.2mm gun, which could destroy most German tanks at standard engagement ranges. This gave Soviet tank crews the firepower to fight on equal terms with their opponents. Combined with wide tracks, which made it easier to traverse mud and snow, the T-34 was well suited for the challenging terrain of the Eastern Front. The engine was another major innovation. The T-34 was powered by a V2 diesel engine, which was more fuel efficient and less likely to catch fire than gasoline engines used in many other tanks. This allowed the T-34 to have better reliability in the harsh Soviet winters and made it a practical choice for long campaigns. By the time Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the T-34 was already entering production. The Germans were surprised by its advanced design, particularly its sloped armor and powerful gun. German tank crews reported that their standard anti-tank weapons often failed to penetrate the T-34's armor, leaving them vulnerable to counterattacks. Despite its advanced features, the T-34 faced early production challenges. Factories working on the tank were often relocated to the east to escape advancing German forces, which slowed production temporarily. However, Soviet engineers simplified the design to make the tank easier to mass produce. This meant that thousands of T-34s could be built quickly, giving the Soviet Union a numerical advantage over the German forces. By 1942, the T-34 was becoming the backbone of the Red Army's armored forces. It was deployed in large numbers during key battles like Stalingrad and Kursk, where its combination of firepower and mobility proved decisive. German forces struggled to counter the growing numbers of T-34s, even as they introduced heavier tanks like the Tiger and Panther. The T-34's success was not just about its design. It was also about the determination of the Soviet people. Factory workers, often working under difficult conditions, produced tanks around the clock to keep up with demand. Crews were trained rapidly and sent into battle, knowing their tank was one of the best of its time. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the Red Army was caught off guard. Their older tanks struggled to match the speed, firepower, and organization of the German Blitzkrieg, but the introduction of the T-34 helped shift the balance. The T-34 entered combat in the early days of Operation Barbarossa. The Soviet Union had faced months of brutal attacks, with German tanks pushing deep into Soviet territory. The T-34 arrived as a much-needed answer to the challenge posed by the German Panzer III and Panzer IV. The tank had several advantages. Its sloped armor design allowed it to deflect enemy shells more effectively, making it tougher to destroy. This sloped armor was something new at the time, giving the T-34 a strong edge. Its powerful 76.2mm gun could take out most German tanks at a distance, often before they could fire back effectively. One of the most impressive features of the T-34 was its mobility. With wide tracks, the tank could easily navigate the muddy fields and snowy terrain of the Eastern Front. German tanks often struggled in such conditions, but the T-34 proved reliable even in harsh weather. Despite these strengths, the T-34 was not perfect. Early models had limited visibility for the crew, making coordination during battle difficult. Many tank crews were undertrained and thrown into combat with little preparation. Additionally, production had to be rushed due to the German advance, so early T-34s sometimes had quality issues. Still, the T-34 proved to be a formidable weapon in key battles like Moscow and Stalingrad. At Stalingrad, the T-34 played a critical role in countering German armor and supporting Soviet infantry as they pushed back against the encirclement. By 1943, the Soviets improved the T-34 further with upgraded armor and the addition of the 85mm gun. This new version, the T-34, was designed to take on heavier German tanks like the Tiger and Panther. While it still could not match the Tiger's firepower or protection, the T-34's speed, numbers, and adaptability gave the Soviets an advantage in large-scale battles. The Battle of Kursk in 1943 was one of the defining moments for the T-34. The T-34's ability to maneuver across rough terrain and its effectiveness in coordinated attacks helped Soviet forces resist the massive German offensive. At Kursk, waves of T-34s overwhelmed German defenses, highlighting the tank's importance to Soviet success. The Soviets understood the importance of mass production and simplicity. Unlike the complex and time-consuming designs of German tanks, the T-34 was built to be easy to manufacture. This allowed Soviet factories to produce thousands of T-34s, far outpacing Germany's tank production. It was also an important tank for the Soviets in the Battle of Berlin. In April 1945, Soviet forces closed in on the German capital, determined to end the war. The Red Army, armed with thousands of tanks, including the iconic T-34, prepared for a massive assault on Berlin. By this point, Germany's defenses were in backfoots. The Wehrmacht was severely weakened after years of fighting on multiple fronts, and the Luftwaffe could no longer provide meaningful air support. Despite this, Berlin's defenders, including regular soldiers, Hitler Youth, and even older men of the Volkssturm militia, prepared for a desperate last stand. Soviet forces, led by Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev, launched their offensive in mid-April. The Red Army's goal was clear: encircle Berlin and crush the remaining German resistance. Over 2 million Soviet troops participated in the attack, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. The T-34-85, equipped with a more powerful gun and thicker armor compared to earlier models, was well suited for urban combat. Its speed and firepower allowed it to navigate Berlin's rubble-strewn streets and take on German tanks like the Panzer IV and the feared Tiger I. The Soviets also relied heavily on their artillery to soften German defenses, with Katyusha rocket launchers pounding the city relentlessly. As the Red Army advanced, they quickly encircled Berlin by April 25th, cutting off the city from any reinforcements. In battles like Moscow and Stalingrad, the T-34-76 proved invaluable, its simplicity allowing mass production even under wartime conditions. However, as the war progressed, it became clear that the T-34 was starting to lag behind technologically. German tanks like the Panther and Tiger outclassed the T-34-76 in terms of armor and firepower, prompting the Soviets to develop improved versions. So, in view of that, the Soviet Union built a newer tank. The T-34-85 was introduced in 1944 as an upgraded version of the T-34-76. It featured a larger turret and an 85mm gun, which gave it the firepower needed to combat advanced German tanks like the Panther and Tiger I. The thicker armor on the T-34-85 provided better protection for the crew, allowing it to withstand hits from German anti-tank weapons more effectively than its predecessor. This variant became the backbone of Soviet tank forces during the final stages of the war. It played a pivotal role in major offensives such as Operation Bagration and the push into Berlin. Crews praised the T-34-85 for its balance of firepower, mobility, and reliability. Unlike German heavy tanks, which were often plagued by mechanical issues, the T-34-85 could operate effectively in a wide range of environments, from the frozen steppes of Russia to the urban battlefields of Berlin. The T-34-85's design was so successful that it remained in service with various armies well into the Cold War era, proving its enduring value as a combat vehicle. Minefields were a constant threat on the Eastern Front, often stalling offensives and causing heavy casualties. To solve this issue, engineers modified the T-34 into a mine-clearing vehicle. This version was equipped with heavy rollers or chains mounted on the front of the tank. These attachments detonated mines ahead of the tank, creating safe paths for advancing troops and vehicles. The mine roller T-34 was particularly effective during large-scale Soviet offensives, where rapid advances were crucial to maintaining momentum. These vehicles often led the charge, enduring the dangers of enemy mines so that infantry and other tanks could follow. The use of mine-clearing T-34s showcased the adaptability of the tank and its ability to fulfill roles beyond direct combat. Effective communication was critical for coordinating large-scale tank offensives, and the Command T-34 was designed to fulfill this need. These tanks were equipped with additional radio equipment to allow commanders to communicate with their units and headquarters. To accommodate the radios, some ammunition storage was sacrificed, limiting the tank's combat capabilities. However, this trade-off was essential for improving coordination on the battlefield. Command T-34s played an important role in Soviet armored tactics, particularly during the massive offensives of 1943 and 1944. They ensured that tank units could operate as cohesive formations, executing complex maneuvers that overwhelmed German defenses. Without these command vehicles, the effectiveness of Soviet armored forces would have been significantly reduced. As German tanks became more advanced, the need for specialized anti-tank vehicles grew. The Su-85 and Su-100 were self-propelled guns built on the T-34 chassis, designed specifically to counter German heavy tanks. The Su-85 was armed with an 85mm gun, while the Su-100 featured a more powerful 100mm gun capable of penetrating the thick armor of Tiger and Panther tanks. These tank destroyers lacked rotating turrets, relying instead on a fixed gun mounted in a heavily armored superstructure. While this limited their versatility in close combat, it allowed them to excel in long-range engagements. Su-85 and Su-100 units were often deployed in ambush positions, where their high firepower could devastate advancing German formations. These vehicles became a critical component of Soviet anti-tank strategy and contributed significantly to the Red Army's success on the Eastern Front. The need to cross rivers and other natural barriers during offensives led to the development of the T-34 bridge layer. This variant carried a portable bridge mounted on its chassis, allowing Soviet troops to cross obstacles without waiting for traditional engineering teams to construct crossings. The T-34 bridge layer was particularly valuable during rapid advances, where delays could give the enemy time to regroup. These vehicles were used extensively during the final stages of the war, as Soviet forces pushed into Eastern Europe and Germany. Their ability to overcome natural barriers ensured that the Red Army could maintain its momentum, preventing German forces from establishing strong defensive lines. The harsh conditions of the Eastern Front and the constant intensity of combat meant that many T-34s were damaged or immobilized. To solve this, some T-34s were converted into recovery vehicles equipped with cranes and winches. These vehicles were used to tow damaged tanks back to repair depots, ensuring that they could be returned to service as quickly as possible. T-34 recovery vehicles were an essential part of Soviet logistics, keeping armored units operational despite heavy losses. Their contribution was less glamorous than that of combat tanks, but it was no less important. By maintaining the strength of Soviet armored forces, these vehicles played a quiet yet crucial role in the Red Army's victories. The T-34's adaptability was a testament to its innovative design and the ingenuity of Soviet engineers. Each variant addressed a specific challenge, from clearing minefields to destroying heavily armored German tanks. Together, these adaptations made the T-34 one of the most versatile and effective tanks of World War II, continuing its legacy as a backbone of Soviet military strategy.